Hey guys, welcome back. Quick question, have you ever had a bad date? Maybe someone chewed with their mouth open, or worse, talked about crypto. Well, let me take you on a little ride back to ancient China, where a marriage wasn't just bad, it's historically painful. Before you get comfortable, please hit like and subscribe, but only if you truly enjoy what I do. Drop a comment telling me where you're tuning in from and what time it is for you. It's always fascinating to see who's joining us from around the world. Now dim the lights, maybe turn on a fan for that soft background hum, and let's dive together into today's journey. In ancient China, the concept of love and marriage was about as realistic as a dragon sighting. Marriage wasn't about romance, it was about duty, survival, and control. The earliest Chinese marriages were arranged by parents, astrologers, and occasionally, the desperate whispers of ancestors through incense smoke. The bride and groom might not meet until the wedding day. Surprise! You're spending the rest of your life with this stranger. Hope he doesn't snore. From the Zhou dynasty, around 1046 BCE onward, marriage became a transactional institution. The goal wasn't happiness, it was alliance, fertility, and the continuation of the family line. Women were essentially walking wombs with good posture. And men? Well, they were taught early that emotions were for poems, not partnerships. Her future husband's family might begin demanding obedience before she even learned to write her own name. The wedding ceremony, while grand on the surface, was a brutal kind of theater. The bride wore red, not for love, but for luck and blood. Her face hidden behind a veil, she was escorted in a sedan chair, carried like furniture to her new home, where she was expected to obey her husband, serve her in-laws, and give birth. Ideally to boys. Girls? Disappointments with pigtails. And the dowry. Oh, the dowry. A grotesque blend of economics and humiliation. The bride's family paid heavily for the privilege of giving their daughter away. Jewelry, livestock, silk, and money were all part of the price tag. The wealthier the bride's family, the better the dowry. Though even poor families scraped together what they could, selling possessions or laboring for years just to offload their daughter in a halfway decent match. But don't think the groom's family didn't also contribute. They offered betrothal gifts, called pin li, which were supposed to thank the bride's family. In reality, they were more like a receipt. Here's a pig and some coins. We now own your daughter. Please, no returns. Once married, the woman essentially ceased to be a member of her birth family. Filial piety, the Confucian concept that loyalty to one's parents is sacred, got a horrifying twist. A bride now owed loyalty to her husband's parents, not her own. She could only visit her birth family on rare holidays, and even then she had to ask permission like a kid begging for recess. Inside the home, the bride became the lowest-ranking creature in the hierarchy. Below her husband, below her mother-in-law, below her husband's sisters, and probably just above the family goat. If she failed to produce a son, she faced shame, scorn, and in some cases, a shiny new concubine to share the bedroom. Jealousy wasn't just expected, it was institutionalized. Speaking of concubines, let's talk about that mess. Polygamy was totally acceptable for men. A man could have a wife, Qi, and multiple concubines, Qi, creating a mini empire of estrogen and rivalry under one roof. The main wife might be the official lady of the house, but concubines were often younger, prettier, and occasionally favored. Imagine being a first wife watching your husband flirt with a teenage concubine over dinner while you're stuck cleaning up duck bones. And it gets worse. Widowhood. You'd think that the death of an oppressive husband might be a twisted kind of freedom. Wrong. A widow was expected to remain loyal to her dead husband for the rest of her life. Remarriage? Shameful. Forbidden in many dynasties. A virtuous widow was one who wore mourning clothes until her own death, and maybe threw herself into his funeral pyre just to really commit to the bit. Yes, suicide was sometimes praised, not because it was tragic, but because it proved chastity. A woman who killed herself after her husband died was celebrated. Memorial arches were built in her name. Look, they'd say, such loyalty, such devotion, all while quietly reminding the living women, don't even think about moving on. And if you're wondering whether women ever had a say in any of this, spoiler alert, they didn't. Divorce? A legal option, but only for men. A husband could dismiss his wife for reasons ranging from infertility to jealousy to excessive talking. Yes, really. Too loud was a valid reason to exile your wife, but a woman trying to divorce a man? Not unless she had royal blood and an army. Otherwise, she was stuck, no matter how cruel or abusive her husband might be. Now, let's pause and add a spicy twist of cosmic horror. Ghost marriages. Yes. The Chinese had a practice, still occasionally found in remote areas, of marrying the dead. If a man died unmarried, his family might arrange a wedding for him in the afterlife, usually by marrying him to a deceased woman. Sometimes it was two skeletons getting hitched. Sometimes a living woman was forced to marry the dead man, move in with his family, and live the rest of her life as a widow, in-laws included, and don't even start imagining romantic hauntings. These ghost marriages were transactional. Families believed that a bachelor ghost would haunt them until he had a wife in the afterlife, so they solved the problem by digging up a solution, literally. Let's not forget the matchmaking methods. In some dynasties, matchmakers used astrology, fortune tellers, and the girl's birth chart to decide compatibility. Ah yes, her fire tiger clashes with his water pig. That'll be a bumpy honeymoon. And yet the marriage would proceed, because clearly nothing says long-term happiness like clashing zodiac signs and zero mutual consent. Even the wedding night was less romantic moonlit bliss and more awkward ceremonial nightmare. In many traditions, the bride was silent, passive, and expected to weep, not because she was moved, but because she was mourning her freedom. A stoic or smiling bride was considered suspicious. A sobbing one? Just right. So yes, ancient Chinese marriages were not just unromantic. They were systemic nightmares dressed up in silk robes and firecrackers. What looked like celebration was often the beginning of a lifetime sentence, written in etiquette manuals, enforced by family, and sealed with fear, and we're only getting started. Wait until you hear about how child brides, coerced vows, foot binding, and Confucian rituals created a maze of suffering that would last for centuries. Oh, and did we mention the love letters written in blood? If you thought the first part was rough, welcome to the next layer of the underworld, Marriage Edition. Part 2 is where things really start to unravel, because while foot binding and ghost weddings were bad enough, what happened inside the marriage was a whole different flavor of agony. Think you know what domestic life looked like in ancient China? Think again. It was a soap opera written by Confucius and edited by a particularly cruel demon. Let's begin with the in-laws. The mother-in-law in ancient Chinese culture wasn't just a character, she was an institution. Once a woman was married, her husband's mother effectively became her new emperor. She controlled the household, the finances, the chores, and most importantly, her daughter-in-law's life. If the new bride so much as blinked wrong, she could be verbally shamed, physically punished, or forced to do humiliating tasks for her own good. In some cases, mother-in-laws abused their daughters-in-law with such severity that women developed stress-related illnesses, tried to flee, or in extreme cases died from sheer exhaustion and neglect. And the cherry on top? The woman, if she survived long enough, would eventually become a mother-in-law herself and repeat the cycle with unholy enthusiasm. Misery, after all, was a family tradition. Now, let's talk expectations. A wife in ancient China had 3 roles: obey her father before marriage, her husband during marriage, and her sons in widowhood. Known as the 3 obediences, this delightful policy ensured that women were never free, not even when everyone else around them was dead. They were expected to be silent, modest, hardworking, fertile, and, if possible, invisible. Sex? That wasn't about pleasure. That was a duty. Women weren't taught about desire. They were taught about duty, timing, and fertility charts. Entire books were written by male scholars about when a husband should sleep with his wife, not for her needs, but to balance yin and yang or to avoid bad omens. Imagine lying in bed while your husband checks a calendar to see if it's auspicious to touch you, and if it wasn't, better luck next full moon. Children were the main reason for marriage, specifically male children. If a woman had a daughter first, bad luck. If she had only daughters, tragedy. Some women were kicked out of their homes for not producing sons. Others watched helplessly as concubines were brought in to solve the problem. Because clearly, nothing improves family harmony like competitive baby making. And if you think women could at least raise their kids in peace, think again. The mother-in-law often assumed control of the children's upbringing, deciding everything from names to education. The wife, who literally birthed them, might be ordered not to interfere. She was there to carry the baby, not parent it. Like a rented womb with no warranty. Let's dive a little deeper into foot binding, because yes, this nightmarish practice was tied directly to marriage. Foot binding began in the Song dynasty and was eventually seen as essential for women who wanted to marry into wealth. Little girls as young as 5 had their feet broken, the arches crushed, and the toes folded under until they resembled twisted lotus buds. The goal? Feet no longer than 3 inches. These golden lotuses were considered the height of beauty and refinement. The result? Excruciating pain, lifelong disability, infection, and a gait that made women shuffle like wounded ghosts. But hey, limping meant you were delicate. Limping meant you were desirable. Limping meant you might marry a slightly richer merchant and live a slightly less horrible life. So thousands of families maimed their daughters in pursuit of status, survival, and dowry negotiations. Love? Not even on the list. And yes, some men had foot fetishes long before Freud made it weird. There were poems, songs, even instructional manuals on how to appreciate a bound foot. Some described the ideal foot as smelling like fragrant rot. Others believed that a woman's erotic power was concentrated entirely in her deformed feet. Forget kissing. Toe touching was the real intimacy. Just don't think about the infections. Speaking of infections, let's return to ghost marriages for a second, because the more you learn, the more horrifying they become. Sometimes families couldn't find a dead bride for their dead son, so they'd create one. Poor families, desperate for money, would sell their deceased daughters to richer families, looking for a posthumous daughter-in-law. These girls' bodies were exhumed, dressed in wedding robes, and married in rituals that included incense, paper offerings, and in some cases burned effigies of a dowry. It was the ultimate lose-lose situation. Born poor, died young, and then married off to someone you didn't know, in the afterlife, to please strangers. But wait, it gets worse. Sometimes living girls were married to dead men. These widows by contract moved in with their dead husband's family, wore mourning clothes, and lived as though the man they never met was just out on a long business trip. They couldn't remarry. They couldn't have children. Their purpose was to honor a man who was already a ghost, and to keep his ancestral altar warm. It was one of the most surreal examples of patriarchal madness in history. Let's return now to concubinage, because we haven't yet plumbed the depths of that disaster. Concubines weren't just romantic side characters. They were often kidnapped, purchased, or born into servitude. While official wives came from respectable families with arranged marriages, concubines could be slaves, entertainers, or war spoils. Their marriage was barely legal. They had fewer rights than wives and could be discarded, sold, or given away if they displeased the husband or bored him. And yet, if a concubine gave birth to a son, she gained sudden, terrifying power. That son could inherit wealth, titles, or family name. The main wife might be forced to raise the concubine's child as her own. Some wives plotted against concubines. Some concubines poisoned the main wife. Household harmony? Ha, more like Game of Thrones with embroidery. Divorce laws, too, were a mess of cruelty. A man could divorce his wife for 7 reasons. Disobedience to in-laws, barrenness, adultery, jealousy. Yes, being jealous was a punishable offense. Hereditary disease, theft, and talkativeness. But if she had no family to return to, he was not allowed to divorce her. Because nothing says compassion like, "You're terrible, but I guess you can keep living in the shed." On the flip side, women had virtually no legal grounds to divorce a man. Abandonment, abuse, infidelity, too bad. Unless the man disappeared or died, she was legally chained to him. Some women took matters into their own hands, poisoned wine, slow arsenic, creative accidents, but that risked execution if caught. Speaking of punishments, women who broke marriage laws could be subject to public shaming, beatings, exile, or even death. Adulterous wives were executed, adulterous husbands may be scolded, maybe. More often than not, they were simply praised for their masculine energy. Because apparently cheating was just another way to express one's inner yang. And as for love, love was a luxury for poets, prostitutes, and ghosts. Ordinary married couples rarely expressed affection openly. A husband writing a love poem to his wife was seen as eccentric. A wife speaking fondly of her husband? Suspicious. Love was dangerous. It disrupted the social order. It made people believe in choices. And nothing was scarier to ancient patriarchy than a woman who thought she had a choice. But don't worry, there's still more horror to come. In the next part, we'll dig into forbidden affairs, brutal wedding tests, love suicides, the role of Taoist sex manuals, and why some brides were carried to their weddings in coffins. Because in ancient China, marriage wasn't just a contract. It was a spiritual cage, an economic prison, and sometimes a literal funeral procession. Welcome back to the emotional minefield that was marriage in ancient China. If you've made it this far, congrats. You're officially emotionally scarred, historically informed, and possibly rethinking every rom-com you've ever watched. Because while love today is complicated, back then, it was practically a felony. And now, in part 3, we're going deeper. We'll explore the heartbreaking poetry of forbidden love, the grotesque tests brides had to endure, Taoist sex manuals that were somehow both repressive and deranged, and yes, why some weddings looked suspiciously like funerals. Let's start with something that sounds romantic, but was almost always tragic: love affairs. In a culture where arranged marriages were mandatory and romantic compatibility was considered an inconvenience at best, actual love was treated like a dangerous infection. If a woman dared to fall for a man not chosen by her parents, or worse, someone outside her social class, it could destroy her life. Love letters had to be passed in secret, hidden in embroidery, or smuggled inside mooncakes. Getting caught could mean beatings, exile, or death. But of course, people still fell in love. Some of the most haunting Chinese folktales are about doomed lovers. Take the legend of Liang Shanbo and Zhu Yingtai, sometimes called the butterfly lovers. Zhu disguises herself as a man to get an education, falls in love with her classmate Liang, and they vow eternal love. But when her father forces her into an arranged marriage, Liang literally dies of heartbreak. Zhu throws herself into his grave, and they both emerge as butterflies. Beautiful, right? Also deeply depressing. And real life? Even worse. There were countless cases of couples committing double suicides, jumping into rivers, swallowing poison, or hanging themselves in ancestral temples because they couldn't marry each other. Their only chance at love was in death. Society's response? Mixed. Sometimes their ghosts were honored. Other times, they were used as cautionary tales to frighten teenagers into compliance. Study hard, obey your parents, or you'll become a butterfly too. Let's pivot from heartbreak to humiliation. Wedding tests. No, I'm not talking about cold feet. I'm talking about literal ceremonial torment designed to test a bride's purity, endurance, and subservience. In some regions, brides were subjected to virginity inspections, a practice as invasive as it sounds. A family's honor rested on whether the bride bled on the wedding night. If she didn't, accusations of premarital activity, betrayal, or witchcraft could follow. In more extreme cases, the bride could be sent back to her family in disgrace, ruining her reputation and her future. And then there was bridal crying. In certain provinces, it was customary for the bride to cry for days before the wedding. Not just a single tear for drama, ritual crying. Mothers, grandmothers, aunts, all joined in, creating a chorus of weeping women lamenting the bride's departure from her family. It wasn't just symbolic, it was expected. If the bride didn't cry enough, she was shamed for being ungrateful. If she cried too much, she was mocked for weakness. There was no winning. Just loud, performative sadness with eyeliner running. Now let's talk Taoism, specifically Taoist sex manuals. Yes, ancient China had a long, bizarre relationship with sex. Taoist philosophy believed that sexual activity was a path to immortality, if done correctly. And by correctly, I mean with pages and pages of charts, diagrams, and techniques that read like someone tried to blend yoga, algebra, and fan fiction. According to these manuals, men had a finite amount of life energy stored in their semen. Women, by contrast, were thought to possess limitless yin energy that could rejuvenate a man if he absorbed it during intercourse. So Taoist scholars urged men to avoid ejaculation and instead draw their partner's essence through breath, posture, and sometimes weird pelvic vibrations that definitely didn't work. What about the woman's pleasure? That depended on whether it enhanced her spiritual alignment. Some manuals emphasized that mutual satisfaction created cosmic harmony. Others treated women like tools in the quest for eternal youth. Either way, these texts of wisdom were rarely written by women, which explains a lot. Now for something truly spine-chilling. Funeral weddings. Yes, this happened. In some dynasties, if a bride died before the wedding day, or the groom did, families might still hold the wedding ceremony. The deceased would be dressed in full wedding attire, placed in a coffin, and carried through the streets in a bridal procession. Symbolic vows were read, offerings were made, firecrackers exploded. Then the coffin was buried as though it were a normal marriage, just with a little more rigor mortis. Why? To preserve family honor, to fulfill contracts, to avoid having an unmarried ghost haunting the family estate. And sometimes the living spouse was expected to remain loyal to their dead partner for the rest of their life. Talk about commitment. In even darker cases, a living bride was married to a dead groom. She would join his household, care for his shrine, wear mourning clothes, and never marry again. Her value wasn't as a partner, but as a placeholder for spiritual balance. Basically, a grief-stricken babysitter for a ghost. And yet, somehow, some people found a way to rebel. Women occasionally ran away from arranged marriages. They joined convents, became Taoist priestesses, or disguised themselves as men to travel and escape. A few even became pirates, rebels, or poets, using their wits to carve out some measure of independence in a world that refused to give it willingly. One famous example is the poet and courtesan Li Qingzhao. Though she lived centuries after many of these brutal traditions were formed, her writing offers a rare female perspective on love, marriage, and grief. She was married young, deeply in love, and devastated by her husband's death. But instead of remarrying or fading quietly into widowhood, she wrote poems that openly mourned him, mocked societal expectations, and cataloged her sorrow in aching detail. Her legacy survives, not because she followed the rules, but because she refused to be erased by them. Still, for every Li Qingzhao, there were thousands of unnamed women who lived and died under the suffocating weight of Confucian obedience, ritual silence, and romantic erasure. In the next part, the final act, we'll explore the legacy of these practices. How did they evolve? How long did they last? Are they really gone? Or are we just wearing modern clothes over ancient chains? Welcome to the final descent, dear traveler. We've navigated through arranged childhoods, foot-bound nightmares, ghost weddings, and Taoist sex charts that read like medieval sci-fi. Now, in part 4, it's time to trace the slow-burning fallout of all this matrimonial madness. What became of these customs? Did China eventually liberate its women from this deeply ritualized purgatory? Or did the horrors simply change form and slip into modernity wearing a fresh coat of lipstick and nationalism? Let's start with the slow crumbling of Confucian control. By the late Qing dynasty, cracks had begun to form in the foundation of traditional marriage. Reforms were whispered about in smoky tea houses and radical pamphlets. Intellectuals, many educated abroad, started questioning the Confucian hierarchy that kept women pinned like butterflies under glass. And women? Some began to write, to protest, even to run away. The May 4th movement of 1919 was the first real explosion. Young people, students, feminists, anarchists, rose up against feudal values, arranged marriages, and the oppression of women. Newspapers published scandalous editorials about love matches and personal freedom. Suddenly, the idea that a woman might marry for affection didn't seem like a revolutionary fantasy. It became a goal, but before the revolution could be televised, China collapsed into chaos. Warlords, civil war, and Japanese invasion turned everything upside down. For many families, survival once again took priority over ideals. And so, in some rural areas, child marriage, concubinage, and dowries continued, quietly and stubbornly, like mildew on the walls of history. Then came 1949. The People's Republic of China was born, and with it, the Communist Party's pledge to eradicate feudal marriage. The marriage law of 1950 was a bombshell. It outlawed arranged marriages, concubinage, and child brides. Women were granted the right to divorce, to refuse a suitor, and to marry whom they wished. Propaganda posters featured bold, strong women casting off their wedding veils and kicking away dowry chests. It was loud, it was radical, it was wildly uneven in execution. In cities, things changed fast. Education, propaganda, and urbanization swept away many old customs. But in the countryside, not so much. traditional matchmakers still prowled rural villages. Families still negotiated marriages like livestock trades, and while concubinage was illegal, the mistress culture never really disappeared. It just got modern rebranding. Wealthy men now kept second wives in secret apartments instead of side chambers. Technology didn't kill patriarchy, it just gave it better real estate. Let's talk divorce. Legally permitted? Yes. Socially accepted? Not exactly. Women who divorced in the 1950s and 60s in China were often vilified. Some were accused of being counter-revolutionary or morally corrupt. The law said one thing, society whispered another. And while men could often remarry with ease, divorced women were frequently treated like damaged goods. Meanwhile, family pressure remained relentless. Mothers still urged daughters to marry early, before they expired. Matchmaking markets popped up in city parks, where parents, yes, parents, pinned up bios of their adult children like resume boards, advertising everything from height and salary to whether their daughter had double eyelids. Love, compatibility, personality, secondary. The goal was still status preservation through union. And while foot binding was officially abolished, its psychological cousins still lingered. Enter beauty standards. Women were no longer binding their feet, but they were bleaching their skin, dieting to extremes, getting eyelid surgery, and shrinking themselves in new ways. The system no longer demanded tiny feet. It demanded tiny waists, flawless skin, and absolute submission to romantic timelines. Leftover woman, Sheng Nu, became a common insult for women over 27 who remained unmarried. It was ancient shame with a modern twist, now with hashtags. And dowries? They're back. In many parts of modern China, marriage negotiations still involve massive financial exchanges. The groom's family might offer cash, property, even cars to the bride's family. Brides are once again judged by their family's assets, their fertility, and yes, their obedience. Some call it tradition, others call it a reskinned ransom. Either way, it's proof that the past doesn't vanish, it just mutates. Now, let's zoom out for a second. Why were ancient Chinese marriages so brutal in the first place? It comes down to one word: control. Marriage was never just a personal relationship. It was a system of wealth transfer, alliance building, and population control. By turning women into marital property, by robbing them of choice, mobility, and voice, patriarchal society ensured that power stayed where it wanted to stay, in the hands of fathers, husbands, and sons. Even Confucius, the great philosopher, saw marriage not as an emotional bond, but as a ritual necessity. The harmony of the state depended on the obedience of the wife. A good society began with a good household, and a good household began with a silenced woman. But humans aren't made for cages, no matter how beautifully painted they are. Throughout history, Chinese women have found ways to resist, protest, and subvert. Some used poetry, some used poison, some simply refused to marry. Others raised daughters who would one day run from arranged matches, earn degrees, or blow up on social media, calling out injustice. Today, things are still complicated. Some Chinese women are choosing to remain single, to embrace independence, to skip marriage entirely. They're attacked for it, celebrated for it, interviewed about it, feared for it, because a single woman in a culture built on family lineage is still seen as a glitch in the matrix. But perhaps that glitch is how the system rewrites itself, and so we end where we began, not with romance, but with reality. Ancient Chinese marriage wasn't a fairy tale. It was a battlefield, a bureaucracy, and sometimes a burial. It crushed love beneath ritual. It replaced choice with charts. It silenced generations of women in the name of cosmic harmony. But those women, whether crying behind red veils or writing secret poems in courtyards, have not been forgotten. Their stories live on, in books, in protests, in sarcasm-laced YouTube videos like this one. Because history isn't dead. It's the family heirloom we didn't ask for, but still carry. So next time someone says marriage is traditional, you might want to ask, which tradition exactly? The silk-wrapped sadness, the coffin weddings, the 3-inch feet? Because sometimes the most dangerous thing about history is how familiar it still feels. Thanks for sticking through this descent into ceremonial madness. If you're still here, hit like, drop a comment, and maybe send this to someone planning a wedding. Just maybe don't mention the ghost. Hey guys, ever wonder what happens when a guy with absolute power, a harem the size of a small village, in delusions of divine destiny suddenly drops dead, gets assassinated, or is overthrown by his own cousin. You'd think the story ends with him, but no. That's just the beginning of the real nightmare. Because for the dozens, or sometimes hundreds, of wives, consorts, and palace women left behind, the fall of an emperor wasn't just political, it was apocalyptic. Think reality show elimination round, but with more blood, poison, and eunuchs. When an emperor dies, the wives don't get to cry, light a candle, and move on. Oh no, they get swept into a whirlwind of suspicion, slaughter, exile, and occasionally forced religious enlightenment. Buckle up. Today we're talking about what really happened to the women behind the throne, when the throne collapsed. Let's start with the basics. In Imperial China, emperors didn't just have a wife. They had an entire system of women ranked, rotated, and regulated like a bureaucratic spreadsheet. At the top was the empress, official, respectable, politically married, usually miserable. Below her came the consorts, noble ladies, talented women, and at the bottom of the totem pole, palace maids who were technically unranked, yet often ended up being noticed by the emperor after a few lucky wardrobe malfunctions. When the emperor died, or worse, was overthrown, this entire ecosystem became radioactive. In a best-case scenario, the new regime respected tradition, kept the palace intact, and let the imperial women retire quietly. Worst case? Wholesale slaughter. And believe me, the worst case happened more than you'd like to imagine. Let's jump into one of the most infamous, "Oh no, the emperor is dead. Run, girls, run" moments in history. The fall of the Qin dynasty. Qin Shi Huang, the first emperor of unified China, was a man who loved control so much he tried to outlaw dissenting thoughts. Naturally, when he died in 210 BCE, the empire fell into chaos. His successor was murdered and rebel forces stormed the palace. The imperial women, most were executed. Why? Political insurance. You don't want ex-consorts secretly giving birth to rival heirs or inspiring loyalist uprisings. Better to just clean house. And this wasn't a rare exception. From the Han to the Ming to the Qing, the fall of a dynasty was often marked by a grisly tradition. Kill the emperor's women. Some were poisoned. Some were strangled with silk cords, a classy way to murder someone, apparently. Others were forced to commit suicide in elaborate, ritualized ways, like drinking gold dust, which sounds fancy but is actually a horrifying way to destroy your insides. Still others were given the honor of being buried alive inside the emperor's tomb. Yes, in ancient China it was common for servants, bodyguards, and even concubines to be entombed with the dead ruler, so he'd have company in the afterlife. You warmed his bed, now warm his coffin. Romantic, right? The Han dynasty, for instance, famously practiced the burial of living people alongside royalty. Archaeological digs have found skeletons of women, likely concubines, sealed into underground tombs. They weren't just there to mourn, they were part of the furniture. Now, let's pivot to what happened under dynasties that supposedly ended these uncivilized practices. Spoiler alert, they didn't. The Ming dynasty, 1368 to 1644, officially outlawed live burial, which is nice on paper, but the court still encouraged widowed imperial women to take their own lives after the emperor's death, especially if they had no children. This was considered the ultimate act of loyalty. Translation: you loved him, right? Great. Now prove it with your death. One empress, Fang of the Hongji Emperor, was praised across the empire for refusing to remarry, refusing to speak in public, and living in total seclusion for decades after her husband died. She was treated as a paragon of virtue, a national model for wifely chastity, which is poetic if you ignore the crushing isolation and social death that came with it. But hey, things weren't always that bleak. Some widowed empresses did manage to survive, scheme, and even thrive. Take Empress Lu Ji, wife of Liu Bang, founder of the Han dynasty. When her husband died, she didn't just mourn, she took over, literally. She installed child emperors and ruled from behind the curtain, eliminating rivals like a political ninja in a silk robe. One of her most iconic moves? Capturing a rival concubine, chopping off her hands and feet, gouging out her eyes, and throwing her into a dungeon as a human exhibit. Brutal? Yes. Effective? Also yes. Lu Ji didn't fall after her husband's death. She rose. on a throne of calculated cruelty. This brings us to an important point. Not all imperial widows were victims. Some became power brokers. In fact, palace politics often turned into a blood sport after an emperor's death, with consorts backing their own sons, poisoning rival heirs, and playing an endless game of thrones under the cover of mourning veils. One of the most famous power players, Empress Dowager Cixi. She started as a low-ranking concubine in the Qing dynasty, gave birth to a son, and upon the emperor's death, maneuvered her way into becoming the most powerful woman in China. She ruled for nearly 5 decades, manipulating emperors like chess pieces, building a spy network, and funding massive infrastructure, all while technically being in mourning. But don't get too inspired. Cixi's rise was the exception, not the rule. For every Empress Dowager with a master plan, there were 100 forgotten consorts locked away in lonely palaces, forcibly shaved and dressed in gray, sentenced to spiritual widowhood for the rest of their lives. Which brings us to the Buddhist nunnery option. When imperial women weren't murdered or manipulated into suicide, they were often sent to temples. But don't let the peaceful architecture and incense fool you. This wasn't voluntary enlightenment. It was state-sanctioned exile with holy branding. These women took vows, shaved their heads, and lived out their days in quiet seclusion, praying for the soul of the dead emperor, chanting sutras for karmic redemption, and trying not to think about the life they once lived in gold-threaded gowns and jade earrings. Did they find peace? Maybe. Did they choose it? Rarely. By the time you hit the late Qing dynasty, this brutal tradition had evolved into a grim political tactic. When the Taiping Rebellion briefly overran imperial territory in the 1850s, rebel forces executed dozens of palace women on the spot, considering them symbols of decadent feudalism. The women didn't resist. They bowed, cried, begged, or stood silent. Some were stabbed, some were burned. The empire was collapsing, and they were just collateral beauty. And all of this, mass executions, strategic suicides, spiritual imprisonments, happened not because these women committed any crime, but because they were attached to a man who once ruled and now was gone. They were guilty by association, guilty of proximity, guilty of silk, and yet somehow they endured. Some etched poetry on palace walls with hairpins, some whispered stories to the next generation of maids. Some held onto jade pendants as the only memory of the man they once shared a roof with, and who, in many cases, never even spoke to them. Because yes, some imperial consorts never once met the emperor. In a system where the harem could include hundreds of women, many consorts were decorative hostages, raised in isolation, trained in etiquette, and then locked into a palace they would never leave. They might spend years hoping for one night with the emperor, and when he died, so did the dream. That's the twisted poetry of it all. The wives of fallen emperors didn't just lose a husband, they lost their identity, their purpose, their future. They became relics of a dynasty now gone, ghosts in embroidered robes, too sacred to kill, too dangerous to free. But we're only halfway through. Next, we'll explore how this imperial cruelty echoed into other empires, Rome, Byzantium, the Ottomans, and how power, patriarchy, and paranoia ruined royal women across the globe. If you thought imperial China cornered the market on turning widowed empresses into haunted relics, think again. Because the fate of an emperor's wife, or concubine, or mistress, or even reluctant bride was rarely kind across the ancient world. Power, after all, doesn't just corrupt, it panics, and when power crumbles, the first to fall are those closest to the throne. In part 2, we're taking a jet-setting tour through history's most melodramatic collapses, from Rome to Byzantium to the Ottoman Empire, to see what happened to the women left behind when the crown hit the floor. Let's start with the Romans. If you're picturing togas, grapes, and dramatic deaths via dagger, you're absolutely right, but it gets messier. The Romans had a nasty habit of mixing politics, sex, and paranoia into a kind of lethal wine. Emperors married for alliances, for heirs, for optics, but rarely for love. And when they died, their wives often had 2 options: become a figurehead of mourning or become a scapegoat. Take Messalina, 3rd wife of Emperor Claudius. She was accused, probably falsely, of treason and rampant promiscuity while her husband was away. When he returned, his advisors had her executed before he could even speak to her. The logic? Better safe than sorry. Dead wives tell no tales. Then there's Agrippina the Younger, mother of Nero and wife of Claudius. Yes, the Romans loved to keep it in the family. When Claudius mysteriously died, likely poisoned by Agrippina herself, she installed her son on the throne and ruled through him like a vengeful marionettist. Her reward? Nero had her assassinated in one of the most awkward murders in history, which took multiple attempts, including a collapsing boat and finally, a good old-fashioned dagger. Why? Because once her power was inconvenient, her survival was unacceptable. In Rome, imperial widows weren't mourned, they were managed, manipulated, and murdered, sometimes all at once. Even the supposedly divine Augustus had his wife Livia accused of orchestrating a series of suspicious deaths to clear the path for her son Tiberius. Whether or not she did it, the message was clear. Powerful women outlived emperors at their own peril. Now, let's head east, to the shimmering blood-soaked corridors of Byzantium. Byzantine empresses had one major advantage: ceremony. The empire was obsessed with protocol, tradition, and the divine right of emperors. This meant empresses were often draped in symbolism, gilded, veiled, and made almost untouchable. Almost. Take Empress Theodora. Born a circus performer, yes, that kind of performer, she married Justinian and rose to become one of the most powerful women in Byzantine history. When riots broke out in Constantinople in 532 and Justinian considered fleeing, it was Theodora who famously told him, "Royalty is a fine burial shroud." Translation: die like a ruler, you coward. They stayed, they crushed the revolt, and Theodora kept ruling. But not every empress got a dramatic monologue. Many were quietly pushed aside after an emperor's death. Some were shipped off to monasteries, Byzantium's classy version of political exile. Others were forced to marry the next emperor to keep dynastic continuity intact, regardless of their personal wishes. Imagine burying your husband on Tuesday and getting remarried on Thursday to the guy who may have poisoned him. That was Tuesday in Constantinople. And speaking of death by marriage, let's talk about the Ottoman Empire. Ottoman sultans didn't marry in the traditional sense. Instead, they built massive harems, political factories dressed as pleasure palaces. Each concubine was technically a slave, but in practice, many were foreign nobles or highly educated captives trained in politics, art, and survival. Their goal? Give birth to a son. Because in the Ottoman world, the mother of a prince, Valid Sultan, held enormous power. But power came with a terrifying footnote: fratricide. Every new sultan, upon ascending the throne, had the legal right to execute his brothers, and often did. Why? To avoid civil war. But here's the twisted part. His mother had to stand by and watch, or worse, approve. Imagine nurturing your son through infancy, teaching him to walk, watching him become sultan, and then nodding as he strangles your other sons. This wasn't maternal detachment, it was dynastic necessity. Take Kosem Sultan, one of the most influential women in Ottoman history. She served as Valid Sultan to two sultans, her sons, and acted as regent for her grandson, but her power made her enemies. She was eventually strangled with a curtain by palace eunuchs under orders from a rival empress. That's not just court intrigue, that's Shakespeare with scimitars. And even if you weren't murdered, life after the sultan wasn't exactly a luxury cruise. Widowed concubines were often moved to the Old Palace, a glorified prison where they lived in isolation. Their political usefulness expired. Some were permitted to live in quiet wealth. Others faded into madness, whispering prayers to portraits of men who barely remembered their names. Across empires, China, Rome, Byzantium, the Ottomans, the pattern is brutally consistent. When the emperor or sultan dies, the women closest to him become liabilities. They know too much. They represent old alliances. They might be harboring heirs, so they are erased, contained, sacrificed, or, if they're lucky, forgotten. Not because they did anything wrong, but because they were too close to power, too near the blast radius when the throne explodes. And it wasn't just wives. Daughters, sisters, aunts, any woman tethered to a dead ruler had to navigate a minefield of suspicion, grief, and political fallout. Some made it out, most didn't. Even in more modern monarchies, the rot persisted. In Tsarist Russia, the wives of assassinated royals were often exiled to monasteries or remote estates. After the fall of the Romanovs, Empress Alexandra was imprisoned, humiliated, and finally executed with her children in a Siberian basement. And in France, Marie Antoinette famously went from queen to widow to guillotine in a matter of months, her head a symbol of everything Paris wanted to forget. These stories aren't just about tragedy, they're about design. Monarchies and empires were built to elevate men and consume women. A wife might share a crown, but she never owned it, and once the king fell, her value plummeted faster than a beheaded duke. So what did these women do? They adapted, they schemed, they whispered alliances in the shadows, they turned mourning into manipulation. Some wielded religion, some wielded their sons, some, like Empress Wu Zetian of China, who we'll cover more deeply in the next part, dismantled the entire system and replaced it with their own. But for most, silence, seclusion, survival by submission. In part 3, we'll return to China and dive into the rare and radical cases of imperial widows who refused to fade. From Wu Zetian to the Empress Dowager who rewrote court rules with calligraphy and fire, we'll explore the women who broke the system, or at least shattered the glass coffin it tried to bury them in. Stay with me. The best rebellions are just getting started. You want rebellion? You want vengeance in silk robes and sharpened hairpins? Then welcome to part 3, where widows don't weep, they rule. In this chapter of Imperial Afterlives, we return to China, where a handful of extraordinary women clawed their way out of ceremonial obscurity and rewrote the rules of monarchy from behind the curtain, sometimes literally. You see, when a husband emperor dies, most wives are supposed to vanish into temples, mourning, or polite irrelevance. But some refused to disappear quietly. Some decided, if I'm stuck in the palace, I might as well own the damn thing. Let's start with the empress who did the unthinkable, Wu Zetian, the only woman to ever rule China in her own name. Her story begins like many others. A teenage girl selected to serve Emperor Taizong in the Tang dynasty. She was beautiful, clever, and politically invisible, just another concubine among dozens. When the emperor died, Wu was expected to become a Buddhist nun, as per custom. That would have been the end of her story. Brush up on your sutras, fade into incense-smoked obscurity. But no. Wu Zetian was just getting started. She seduced the next emperor, Taizong's son, and re-entered the court. Slowly, methodically, she began to accumulate influence. She gave birth to sons, secured alliances, eliminated rivals, and possibly strangled a baby or two along the way. Hey, Tang dynasty politics wasn't for the faint-hearted, and when her husband grew ill, she ruled in his name. When he died, she ruled in her son's name. When he annoyed her, she dethroned him and put a more obedient son in his place. And finally, she did the unthinkable, declared herself emperor, not empress consort, not dowager, emperor. Cue the collective gasp of Confucian scholars everywhere. This was heresy, it was insanity, it was absolutely glorious. Wu Zetian built her own bureaucracy, patronized scholars, crushed corrupt officials, and even commissioned a massive stone tablet to proclaim her greatness. She ruled for over 15 years, and when she finally died, historians scrambled to erase or vilify her legacy, which ironically is proof of her impact. You don't try to erase a woman unless she did something unforgettable. But she wasn't alone in bending widowhood into a weapon. Fast forward to the Qing dynasty, where Empress Dowager Cixi took the Wu Zetian playbook and upgraded it with opium, gunboats, and explosive court drama. Cixi started as a low-ranking concubine to Emperor Xianfeng, but she gave birth to his only surviving son, instantly elevating her status. When the emperor died in 1861, his son was just 5 years old. Enter the regency. Cixi teamed up with another dowager, orchestrated a palace coup, hidden behind bamboo screens, naturally, and installed herself as co-regent. But unlike most co-rulers, she had no intention of playing second fiddle. She outmaneuvered ministers, exiled rivals, and effectively ran the empire for decades through puppet sons and iron-laced etiquette. She gave court audiences behind a silk screen, where officials had to bow to her shadow while pretending her power didn't exist. That's not just strategy, that's art. Now, was Cixi benevolent? Not exactly. She's been blamed for squandering modernization efforts, mishandling the Boxer Rebellion, and spending naval funds on a fancy marble boat. But she also held a disintegrating empire together through war, rebellion, and colonial pressure. She was a political shapeshifter, widow, regent, mother, manipulator, and occasionally, myth, and she proved something powerful. In a system built to discard women after the emperor dies, it's possible to become the system instead. But let's not pretend these were common outcomes. For every Wuzitian or Sixi, there were thousands of nameless women trapped in the emperor's shadow. Most imperial widows didn't rise, they sank. Into cloisters, into depression, into deliberate invisibility. Some took vows and shaved their heads, turning their backs on courtly life. Others were simply locked away, branded as irrelevant once the man who defined them was gone. And for many, the silence wasn't spiritual, it was survival. Because even in death, the emperor's whims ruled. You could be buried alive in his tomb. You could be accused of cursing him from the grave. You could be labeled inauspicious and stripped of titles, children, or even your name in the official records. Widowhood wasn't a chapter, it was a verdict. But in the cracks of this cruelty, stories survived. Women who smuggled letters out of confinement, warning allies of plots. Women who posed as servants to escape palace arrest. Women who carved poems into the walls of isolation chambers, refusing to let their voices be erased. These weren't revolutions with fireworks and armies. These were revolutions of presence, of memory, of endurance. Even in the Mughal Empire of India, similar dynamics haunted imperial women. After Emperor Shah Jahan's beloved Mumtaz Mahal died, he built the Taj Mahal, a monument to love, yes, but also a reminder of how little freedom women had in life. His surviving wives faded into historical footnotes. The architecture was eternal. The women were ephemeral. The pattern repeated again and again. Emperors fall. Wives vanish unless they fight. And fight they did. Not always with swords, but with silence, subversion, and strategic motherhood. They raised heirs. They counseled them. They plotted against rivals. They endured suspicion, exile, even execution. Not because they were dangerous, but because they could be. Because the mere presence of a former empress in a palace of shifting power was like a ticking bomb under a silk cushion. In part 4, we'll turn to the brutal beauty of historical memory. How did cultures remember or forget these women? How were widows turned into villains, saints, or myths? And how do modern historians untangle fact from fear-mongering when it comes to female power in a man's crumbling world? The story's almost over, but the reckoning just beginning. Let's begin where all legacies end, memory. You'd think surviving the death of an emperor, the viper pit of court intrigue, and several decades of political exile might earn a woman a respectful mention in the history books. But no. More often than not, imperial widows were buried twice, once in tombs and once in silence. You see, when new regimes rise, they don't want reminders of the old guard, especially not reminders with royal blood and first-hand knowledge of every secret behind the throne. So what do you do with dangerous memories? You edit them. Take Wu Zetian, for instance. After her death, Confucian historians wasted no time dragging her name through the mud. She was called cruel, lustful, unnatural, because obviously only a madwoman would want power. Never mind that she brought administrative reforms, boosted agriculture, and even tried to reduce the aristocracy's chokehold on government. Nah, she's remembered as the scheming harlot who dared to sit on the dragon throne, as if her real crime wasn't murder or manipulation, but being a woman who refused to disappear. And don't even get historians started on Cixi. For decades, she was the pantomime villain of Qing collapse, extravagant, backward, obsessed with pearls and opera, the empress who built a fake marble boat while foreign troops burned down Beijing. The image stuck, even though recent scholarship paints a far more complex picture, one of a woman navigating an impossible role in an imploding empire. But nuance is boring. Scandal sells. It wasn't just Chinese dynasties either. Around the globe, widows of monarchs were expected to be walking ghosts, seen rarely, heard never, and remembered only as a footnote in someone else's story. If they dared to influence policy, they were labeled manipulative. If they stayed aloof, they were cold. If they joined religion, pious. If they didn't, immoral. The role was a trap in the history books, written with poisoned ink. So what about the ones who didn't make it into the grand narratives? The ones whose names were stripped from records, whose portraits were burned or hidden, whose stories live only in whispered legends or fragmentary poems? Well, those are often the most haunting of all. In the Joseon dynasty of Korea, widowed queens were sometimes kept in separate palaces for the rest of their lives. Their movements were limited, visitors were restricted. They were expected to live like living relics, honored in theory, ignored in practice. Some took to writing poetry, some to gardening, and some, we suspect, simply to staring at the same four walls until their minds turned foggy with isolation. And yet, some of those women still managed to influence politics, through nieces, eunuchs, or coded messages smuggled in with fruit baskets. Where there's oppression, there's a resistance, even if it's in silk slippers. Meanwhile, in Mughal India, royal widows entered the zenana, a secluded section of the palace meant to be their eternal cloister. It was a prison dressed as luxury. Behind its ornate jolly screens and jasmine-scented courtyards, the women were expected to vanish into domestic prayer and embroidery. But many did not. Some became patrons of the arts. Some advised sons, nephews, or ambitious viziers. Some, like Nur Jahan, ruled entire provinces from behind those carved screens. Soft power is still power. And soft rage, that's the kind that simmers for generations. And then there's Europe. Don't let the lace and tiaras fool you. Queens consort were disposable too. When King Henry VIII died, his last wife Catherine Parr survived him, and was pregnant within a year with her new husband's child. But it didn't end well. She died in childbirth, leaving behind a daughter and a whisper of scandal. Her biggest crime? Moving on. Royal widows were expected to mourn forever, or at least until it was convenient for their successors to marry them off again like political chess pieces. But in Eastern empires, remarriage was often forbidden. Loyalty to a dead emperor was eternal, even if he had 30 concubines and barely remembered your name. In the worst cases, loyalty was enforced with cold steel and hot coals. Widow burning, or sati, in parts of pre-modern India meant that royal wives, especially high-caste ones, were sometimes expected to throw themselves onto their husband's funeral pyre. Voluntarily, of course. Just with a little pressure from in-laws and priests and, centuries of cultural expectation, those who refused, shunned, cursed, blamed for political instability or crop failure. And in ancient Japan, some imperial concubines were ritually buried alive alongside their emperors, not because they were criminals, but because they were loyal. This wasn't devotion, this was annihilation masquerading as virtue. So how did it come to this? Because empires were built on hierarchy, and hierarchy doesn't like loose ends. A widow of an emperor, she knows too much. She holds potential claims to power. She carries dynastic blood in her veins, which makes her a problem. So cultures invented ways to manage that problem. Cloisters, nunneries, widow palaces, forced silence, honor codes, religious conversion, disgrace, death. And yet, again and again, some widows refused to be erased. They became ghostwriters of policy, puppeteers behind thrones, or occasionally rulers in their own right. Their weapons weren't swords. They were bloodlines, alliances, memory. And when the history books tried to forget them, they etched their legacies in architecture, in whispers, in rebellion. Which brings us here, to now. You, sitting in a chair in 2025, in air conditioning, maybe holding a coffee, possibly scrolling past this video while waiting for your dinner to cook. And them, imperial widows, long dead, mostly forgotten, once so powerful and so feared they had to be buried twice, just to silence them. But they're not silent now, are they? Because we just spent 8,000 words resurrecting them. And maybe that's the final irony, that in an age obsessed with digital noise, we find ourselves haunted by voices that were never supposed to speak again. Their stories were meant to end in tombs, in temples, or in the margins of royal biographies. But here we are, listening, and just maybe, they're laughing. Imagine being told as a little girl that one day you'd marry a prince, live in a palace, wear diamonds the size of your eyeballs, and then promptly die of childbirth, poison, palace intrigue, syphilis, or sheer emotional obliteration before the age of Mupatayn Dawde. Royal marriages weren't fairy tales. They were high-stakes blood contracts sealed with pearls and lies. This is not Cinderella. This is Game of Thrones, with worse plumbing and no exit door. Royal marriage. The phrase sounds so elegant, doesn't it? Silks, trumpets, dancing under moonlight. But for most of history, Being married into royalty was less a romance and more a cleverly disguised death sentence with embroidery. You weren't chosen for your charm or your sparkling wit. You were chosen because your uterus could produce heirs and your last name could be weaponized in foreign diplomacy. Bonus points if you could keep smiling through 16 miscarriages and a husband who treated you like a glorified diplomatic napkin. Let's start with the basics. You are a noblewoman, maybe 13 if you're lucky, and you've just been told that you're marrying the cousin of a king in a country you've never visited, whose language you don't speak, and whose primary interests are war, falconry, and possibly not bathing. Your dowry has already been exchanged, your fate sealed in letters signed with wax and regret, and the entire court is clapping as you're loaded into a carriage like ceremonial cargo. You arrive and bam, the expectations begin. Produce sons, ideally 3, one for the throne, one for the army, and a spare in case the first 2 die of gout or sword wounds. Be graceful, always. Be quiet, always. Bleed with dignity. Smile while your husband parades mistresses through your palace like a Renaissance bachelor party. And above all, never ever complain. You're a queen now, which means you suffer in gold-threaded silence. Let's talk France. Ah, France, the land of romance and terminal syphilis. Take poor Marie Antoinette, Austrian princess, teenage bride to a French dauphin who barely looked at her for years. She was blamed for everything from the grain crisis to the rain not falling properly. She became queen, and suddenly everyone wanted her to be elegant, obedient, fertile, and invisible. Instead, she had the audacity to throw parties, wear fashionable dresses, and, gasp, exist. Spoiler, she got her head cut off. Across the channel in England, things weren't much better. Let's play a little game called How Many Wives Did Henry VIII Kill or Emotionally Shatter? That's right, 6. Divorced, beheaded, died, divorced, beheaded, survived. And by survived, we mean emotionally demolished and imprisoned in a drafty castle filled with regret and probably rats. These weren't just marriages, they were public endurance trials wrapped in a wedding veil. Now, hop over to Russia, meet the Romanovs. And before the Catherine the Great rode into history on her Enlightenment warhorse, she was just a German teenager named Sophie, sent to Russia to marry a man-child named Peter III, who collected toy soldiers and possibly hated bathing. She was isolated, surveilled, and trapped in a foreign court where everyone spoke in riddles and poisoned wine. Eventually, she overthrew him in a coup, possibly had him killed, and ruled the empire herself. Romantic? Not even slightly. But at least she lived. In Spain, Isabella of Castile married Ferdinand of Aragon, not because they were madly in love, but because it was politically brilliant. Together, they unified Spain and launched the Inquisition. Ah, love. Nothing says soulmate like mass persecution, and yet Isabella, despite her power, was constantly surrounded by loss. 4 of her 5 children died young or suffered miserable fates. Her daughter Joanna descended into madness, and Isabella herself died overworked, grieving, and spiritually exhausted. Being a royal wife wasn't just emotionally annihilating, it was physically lethal. Let's talk childbirth. Modern medicine has fooled us into forgetting how terrifying childbirth was for most of human history. In royal courts, it was public spectacle mixed with medieval science fiction. Queens were expected to give birth in front of witnesses, noble women, doctors, midwives, priests, all watching to verify the legitimacy of the heir. Imagine that. Your uterus becomes a state-sponsored performance. And if you bled out on the bed, well, at least your child could inherit the throne. Congrats. Take Jane Seymour, Henry VIII's 3rd wife. She gave birth to the long-desired male heir, Edward VI. 3 days later, she died. Complications from childbirth, most likely an infection. Henry mourned her for a suspiciously long time, possibly because she had finally done what his previous wives could not, die conveniently after producing a son. And don't forget Elizabeth of York, who died at 37 after delivering her 7th child, 5 of whom had already died. Royal marriage wasn't a privilege. It was a medically sanctioned death lottery, where your ticket was drawn the moment the crown touched your head. But let's zoom out. Why were these marriages so brutal? Because they weren't about people. They were about dynasties, bloodlines, legitimacy, power. You weren't a wife, you were a vessel. You were an alliance with ovaries. The personal didn't exist, only the political. Royal wives were traded like rare spices. You needed an alliance with Spain? Marry their infanta. Need peace with France? Offer your daughter like a diplomatic olive branch with a nice neckline. Even if you hated each other, even if you had nothing in common, even if the marriage was doomed from the first awkward, perfumed night, you smiled. You waved, you lied, and woe unto you if you failed to produce a male heir. That was the true royal sin. No son? Suddenly your jewels get smaller, your ladies-in-waiting vanish, your husband spends more time hunting, philandering. The court gossips, the priests whisper, and eventually your replacement arrives, younger, more fertile, more politically useful. Your fall from grace begins with silence and ends in shadow. Maybe you're sent to a convent, maybe you die mysteriously, maybe you live on, but barely. A footnote in the margins of another man's biography. So what about the ones who fought back? Oh, they existed, and they were terrifying. Stay tuned for part 2, because next we're diving into the women who refused to be sacrificed. The queens who outlived their husbands, outmaneuvered their enemies, and turned marriage into a power play. Not all royal wives went quietly into that poisoned night. Some set the palace on fire and danced in the ashes. They told her to marry for duty, she married for empire, and then she outlived them all. Welcome back to the horror story politely labeled Royal Marriage. In part 1, we explored how being a queen was a fast track to grief, ghosts, and gynecological trauma. But now it's time to meet the women who flipped the script. The wives who refused to be reduced to breeding machines and brocade. The queens who said, "Oh, you wanted a pawn? Sorry, you just married a queen with checkmate ambitions." Let's start with the reigning titaness, Catherine de' Medici. Born into one of the most powerful banking families in Europe, Catherine was married off to Henry II of France at 14. Romantic, right? Well, her husband preferred his older mistress, Diane de Poitiers, and Catherine was shoved to the side like politically expensive wallpaper. But guess who laughed last? After Henry II died in a jousting accident, yes, jousting, because history never lacks flair, Catherine ruled France through her sons as Queen Mother. She basically turned the throne into a blood-soaked chessboard. She orchestrated political marriages, suppressed rebellions, and likely played a hand in the infamous St. Bartholomew's Day massacre. Was she ruthless? Absolutely. Was she a victim? Not anymore. Royal wife turned royal puppet master. Next up, Eleanor of Aquitaine. Oh, Eleanor, patron saint of not-today patriarchy. First married to the King of France, she endured a cold, joyless union. She went on crusade with him, because apparently marital suffering wasn't enough, and then divorced him, which in the 12th century was like announcing you'd like to be excommunicated and burned, please. But she didn't stop there. She married the future King of England, Henry II, and gave birth to Richard the Lionheart and King John. When her husband grew paranoid and controlling, she didn't cry into her embroidery. She launched rebellions, actual rebellions, against her own husband. Eventually, she was imprisoned because that's how husbands said, "Please stop undermining my monarchy," back then. Yet she still outlived him, helped run the kingdom in her son's absence, and died at 82 in a time when the average woman barely made it to menopause. You want survival? Eleanor wrote the playbook. Let's talk about Empress Theodora of Byzantium. Former actress, courtesan, she married Emperor Justinian and rose to one of the most powerful thrones in the ancient world. When a riot broke out threatening the empire, Justinian was ready to flee. Theodora stood her ground and said, "Purple makes a fine burial shroud." Translation: if I'm going down in royal dignity while you run like a coward. They stayed. They crushed the rebellion. And Theodora went on to become a political force, championing women's rights, strengthening laws against forced prostitution, and proving that sometimes the best politician in the palace wore pearls in defiance. But it wasn't always grandeur. Sometimes resistance came quietly, slowly, tragically. Consider Empress Masako of Japan, a modern royal married into the chrysanthemum throne, Harvard-educated, accomplished, multilingual, and brilliant, and then suddenly expected to reduce herself to a silent, smiling producer of male heirs. For years, she disappeared from public view, reportedly suffering under the suffocating pressure of imperial tradition and the constant expectation to bear a son. She became a ghost in her own story, a cautionary tale in real time, not medieval. Not mythical, just modern royal suffering, broadcast politely through national silence. So no, not every queen set fire to the palace. Some simply endured, slowly breaking under the weight of ceremonial perfection. And yet, even that quiet resistance matters. Back in Europe, we can't ignore Anne of Austria, who married into the French monarchy and bore Louis XIV, the Sun King himself. Her early years were lonely and humiliating. Her husband, Louis XIII, wasn't exactly a beacon of romantic warmth, but when he died, Anne became regent for her son, ruling France with political savvy and unwavering will during his minority. She navigated civil war, crushed noble uprisings, and managed to keep both the throne and her son alive, which, let's face it, was no small feat in France. And let's circle back to the ever-bleeding disaster that was the Tudor dynasty. Queen Mary I of England, aka Bloody Mary, married Philip II of Spain for an alliance that was supposed to solidify her reign. Instead, the people revolted. Her marriage soured like a bucket of medieval cream, and she died childless and broken, leaving the crown to her half-sister Elizabeth. But Elizabeth wasn't just any royal wife, she was no wife at all, which brings us to the power of saying no. Elizabeth I ruled alone. She turned down every proposal, played foreign princes like fiddles, and declared herself married to England. It was a calculated act of survival, because she knew exactly what happened to queens who married. They were erased, exploited, or eliminated. Instead, she reigned for 44 years. And while her choice came with rumors, loneliness, and relentless pressure, she survived that where so many before her had not. Elizabeth didn't escape the prison. She redesigned it and ruled from within. But let's not forget the hundreds, no, thousands of royal women whose names we don't know. The teenage girls shipped across borders, the duchesses married off to men twice their age, the empresses who gave birth in agony and died in obscurity, the queens who faded into footnotes while history celebrated their husbands' conquests. For every Catherine or Eleanor, there were 100 unnamed noble women who played their part, bore the pain, and vanished into archival dust. Why? Because royalty wasn't a privilege, it was a performance. One with high stakes, strict roles, and zero understudies. And the show always went on. In part 3, we'll explore the mechanisms that kept this deadly machine running. The court advisors, the political pressures, the religious expectations. We'll step behind the curtain to see how royalty turned marriage into a weapon of state, and why, centuries later, its echoes still haunt the crowns of today. The royal marriage was never really about love. It was about leverage, land, and lineage. But behind the grand processions and golden crowns, an invisible machine kept this brutal system alive, a carefully orchestrated web of advisors, spies, priests, power brokers, and poisoners. Welcome to the backstage of monarchy, where the real blood was spilled not on the battlefield, but at the banquet table, in the birthing chamber, and under the marriage bed. Let's start with dynastic anxiety, the heartbeat of every royal marriage. The whole reason queens were brought into the fold, often against their will, was to secure the future of a dynasty through male heirs. Not a boy? Try again. Still no boy. You're failing your nation. That pressure wasn't just domestic, it was political warfare with a uterus. Take Marie Antoinette. Imported from Austria like fine porcelain, she was expected to produce a future king of France almost immediately. But her husband, Louis XVI, was shy, awkward, and possibly suffering from a medical condition that made intercourse difficult. This turned the French court into a reality show from hell. Pamphlets mocked her, foreign diplomats gossiped, and her very relevance teetered on the edge of reproductive roulette. Eventually, she bore children, but by then the people wanted her head, not her heirs, and they got both. But the pressure didn't only come from royal husbands or angry mobs, it came from court factions. Think of the royal court as high school with powdered wigs, secret assassinations, and massive geopolitical consequences. Queens were spied on by their ladies-in-waiting, manipulated by in-laws, and isolated by language and culture. They were chess pieces, and everyone wanted to be the player. One misstep could be fatal. Ask Anne Boleyn, the charismatic second wife of Henry VIII. She played her hand too well. Promoted from mistress to queen, she failed to produce a son, made enemies fast, and was beheaded after trumped-up charges of adultery and incest. The execution wasn't just punishment, it was a state-sponsored message. produce heirs or perish. Meanwhile, men could remarry, kings could wage wars, take mistresses, ignore their children, and still be called noble. But women? Women were the dynasty's life support system, and when the system failed, they were the first to be unplugged. Now enter religion, the divine rubber stamp on all of this cruelty. In Catholic Europe, a queen was a sacred vessel. Her fertility wasn't just biology, it was destiny. And infertility? That was God's judgment. In Protestant countries, things weren't much better. Royal women were symbols of virtue and obedience, constantly measured against the Virgin Mary and yet punished like Eve. But God help you if you actually wielded power. Consider Juana of Castile, daughter of the Catholic monarchs Ferdinand and Isabella. She was intelligent, educated, and should have ruled Spain with authority. But she showed signs of depression, very likely worsened by the death of her beloved husband, and was locked away for decades, declared mad by a father and son who conveniently needed her out of the way to rule in her place. She wasn't mad. She was inconvenient, and inconvenient women had a way of disappearing. Even the birthing room was a political arena. Royal births were public events, sometimes with courtiers watching the queen give birth to ensure the baby was legitimate. Imagine the most vulnerable, painful moment of your life turned into a spectacle for the state. No privacy, no anesthesia, just national pressure and the looming fear of death. Queen Jane Seymour died 12 days after giving birth to Edward VI. Her prize? A ghostly reputation as Henry VIII's true wife, because she gave him the son that others couldn't. She became the standard against which other queens were judged, not for her intellect, not for her diplomacy, but because she died successfully in childbirth. That's the horror. Dying in childbirth was often seen as a queen's most noble accomplishment. Behind the scenes, marriage contracts were engineered like treaties. Queens came with dowries, armies, or territory, and if the alliance soured, too bad. Divorce wasn't just scandalous, it was apocalyptic. Henry VIII split with the entire Catholic Church just to get rid of Catherine of Aragon. His desire for a male heir helped kickstart the English Reformation and years of religious bloodshed. All because royal marriage wasn't a relationship, it was a war strategy with lace cuffs. And don't be fooled into thinking the abuse stopped at the queen. The women around her, the ladies-in-waiting, the noble women, even her own daughters, were swept into the same cruel system. Take Princess Caroline of Brunswick, wife of the future George IV of England. Their marriage was a disaster from day one. He was drunk and disgusted, she was loud and unfashionable. He wanted her gone, but couldn't get a clean divorce. So he waged a campaign to publicly shame her, dragging her name through mud with endless accusations. She was barred from her own coronation, a wife in title, a ghost in practice, and the audience? They laughed, the court gossiped, the newspapers thrived. Royal scandal was its own industry. This machine didn't run on love, it ran on expectation, humiliation, and absolute control. The queen's wardrobe? Chosen for her. Her letters, read by others. Her food, tasted for poison. Her friendships, weaponized, and still she had to smile. Still she had to produce heirs. Still she had to endure. Even queens who dared to rule in their own name, like Isabella of Castile or Christina of Sweden, were anomalies, praised when useful, mocked when independent. Christina, in fact, abdicated her throne, refused to marry, converted to Catholicism, and ran off to Rome, where she scandalized everyone by wearing pants and debating philosophers. She traded her crown for freedom, and people called her mad, because if you were a royal woman, your job was to suffer beautifully, to die with grace, or live in a gilded box while men debated your worth. So no, royal marriage wasn't romance, it was royal survival. A gamble where your body was the currency, your womb the battlefield, and your silence the expected anthem. In part 4, we'll peel back the curtain even more, examining the legacies these women left behind, how their stories were rewritten, misremembered, or erased altogether, and how, despite it all, they shaped kingdoms, changed histories, and haunted the very institutions that tried to control them. Let's end this descent into gilded agony by answering the question, what did these royal women leave behind, besides a trail of blood-stained bedsheets and shattered illusions? Turns out, quite a lot. Even in death, or worse, disgrace, royal women left echoes. Their lives were cautionary tales, romanticized tragedies, political blueprints, and in some glorious cases, time bombs waiting to detonate centuries later. Because while their lives may have been dictated by patriarchal thrones and ironclad expectations, their legacies were not always so easily controlled. Take Anne of Cleves, for example. The fourth wife of Henry VIII, she was married off to the increasingly erratic monarch based on a flattering portrait. When Henry met her in person, he was famously disappointed and dubbed her the Flanders mare. Brutal. But instead of being executed or exiled, Anne negotiated one of the smartest divorces in royal history. She accepted the annulment, stayed in England, got a generous income, her own property, and was referred to as the king's beloved sister. While other wives lost their heads, Anne kept hers and lived comfortably until her death. A true survivor of royal roulette. Then there's Catherine de' Medici, who didn't just endure the French court, she ruled it from behind the scenes. She was widowed young, surrounded by enemies, and yet managed to orchestrate decades of strategy, manipulation, and religious maneuvering. Her enemies painted her as a poison-happy schemer, the wicked witch of the Valois dynasty. But in reality, she was playing a game designed to crush women, and somehow stayed in it longer than most men. The deeper you dig, the more you realize that many of these women were never allowed to be complex. They were flattened into symbols: the whore, the saint, the martyr, the madwoman. Their real stories were too uncomfortable, too resistant, too full of contradiction. Look at Empress Elizabeth of Austria, better known as Sisi. She was stunning, romanticized, and miserable. Married at 16 to Emperor Franz Joseph, she hated court life, developed an obsession with beauty and weight, and was plagued by personal tragedy, including the suicide of her son. Her death came not from politics or childbirth, but by assassination. She was stabbed by an anarchist while walking in Geneva. The blade punctured her heart. The world mourned her as a beautiful, tragic figure, but her entire life had been a gilded cage, and no one noticed until the bars snapped shut. And then there's Alexandra Feodorovna, the last empress of Russia. Married to Nicholas II, she was blamed for everything from political missteps to mystical nonsense due to her relationship with Rasputin. While the empire crumbled and revolution brewed, Alexandra, isolated, anxious, and deeply religious, clung to her role as a devoted wife and mother. But devotion didn't save her. She and her children were executed in a basement by Bolsheviks, bringing an end not just to the Romanovs, but to a whole illusion of divine monarchy. And yet, even in her destruction, Alexandra's image endured, tragic, misunderstood, dressed in pearls and soaked in blood. The reality is, royal women weren't allowed to be people. They had to be icons, sacrifices, myths in human skin. And we, as a species, have been disturbingly good at turning their pain into pageantry. But let's not forget the quiet rebellions. Women like Queen Christina of Sweden, who refused to marry, dressed like a man, and gave up her crown for intellectual freedom. Women like Eleanor of Aquitaine, who got herself out of one disastrous royal marriage and into another, then led a rebellion against her second husband, King Henry II, and helped shape 2 future kings. Women like Wu Zetian, who rose from concubine to emperor of China, not empress, but emperor, and ruled in her own name. These women cracked the system. They didn't always shatter it, but they left it leaking. Still, for every queen who triumphed, hundreds more were forgotten. Married off at 13, dead by 25, buried in silence. Their names were written in treaties, erased from history books, and remembered only in footnotes, or not at all. Because the truth is, royal marriage wasn't designed to elevate women. It was designed to contain them, to use them, to make them beautiful assets that could bleed for the crown and smile for the portraits. It was a contract soaked in obligation, not affection. It was a palace built on bones. And yet, despite all of that, some of these women reshaped empires. They redefined power. They haunted history. Their whispers still rattle in the chandeliers of royal halls, in the black velvet portraits lining museum walls, in the ceremonial language of modern monarchies. Today, when we watch royal weddings with tearful eyes and silly hats, we're not just witnessing tradition. We're witnessing centuries of systemic pain repackaged as fantasy. The tiaras, the veils, the vows, they all carry the weight of generations of women who didn't get a fairy tale ending, just a crown and a coffin. So next time you hear about a royal marriage, remember, Behind every glittering ceremony is a ghost bride whispering, "Run." If you've made it this far, thank you for enduring the agony and absurdity of it all with me. Drop your thoughts below. Whose story hit you hardest? Who surprised you the most? And what kind of history should we uncover next? Until then, remember, the past wasn't prettier. It was just better at hiding the bruises under brocade. Imagine a world where your future, your marriage, and your entire existence were determined by someone you'd never met, someone who got paid in poultry, and someone who could ruin your life with a single scroll. Welcome to Imperial China, where matchmaking wasn't a fun rom-com trope. It was a state-sanctioned labyrinth of control, manipulation, and socially acceptable trauma. Long before dating apps and awkward coffee dates, China had the marital, matchmakers who operated less like Cupid and more like bureaucratic fortune tellers in starched robes. These weren't just well-meaning aunties with a list of bachelors. Oh no. In the imperial system, matchmakers were a weapon of social architecture, agents of Confucian ideology, and occasionally enthusiastic extortionists. Let's set the scene. It's 10th century China. Enter the matchmaker, middle-aged, opinionated, dressed like a walking embroidery project, here to inspect your face, ask about your dowry, and judge your fate with the cold efficiency of a government clerk. But here's the kicker. Matchmakers weren't just randomly selected nosy neighbors. The government actually licensed them. That's right. Becoming a professional bringer of marital doom required registration and approval by state officials. Why? Because marriages were political, economic, and familial contracts, and in a Confucian society obsessed with order, you did not marry for love. You married to fulfill duty. Now, the matchmaker had a sacred tool, the 8 characters, or bazi, derived from the hour, day, month, and year of a person's birth, in accordance with the Chinese lunar calendar. These were fed into astrological charts like a cosmic spreadsheet to determine marital compatibility. Were you a firehorse girl? Oof. Congratulations, you are now considered too dangerous to marry, because legend said you'd burn your husband's luck to ashes. Yes, an entire generation of women born in 1966, the year of the firehorse, faced mass social rejection. Even in the 20th century, some parents avoided having daughters that year, just to dodge that cursed astrological glitch. Who needs Tinder swipes when the stars have already decided you're emotionally radioactive? But it wasn't just horoscopes that matchmakers meddled with. They negotiated the bride price, Kai Li, and the dowry, Jia Zhuang, which were less about romance and more about power balancing. If your family offered a fat dowry, you might snag a groom from a better clan if you had no money. The matchmaker might solve this by bending the truth. A common scam involved exaggerating wealth or fertility. Her cousin had twins. It's practically genetic. Of course, lies like that always came back to bite. And let's not pretend matchmakers were always benevolent guides. In many cases, they were the original spin doctors, masters of PR who turned broken families into noble lineages and lazy sons into budding scholars. Some even colluded with families to sell off daughters under the guise of matchmaking, effectively acting as legal human traffickers. Others accepted bribes to sway their recommendations, playing both sides for maximum profit. If the marriage failed, too bad, no refunds. Now, for a moment, let's zoom out. In Imperial China, women were often married off between the ages of 12 and 16. The younger, the better, because virginity was prized like porcelain. Fragile, pure, and easily broken. Matchmakers ensured that girls were fresh, submissive, and moldable. Their job was to deliver a bride who would bear sons, obey orders, and never ever question why her new husband was 30 years older and smelled like fermented tofu. And what happened when a marriage went south? Absolutely nothing. Divorce was technically possible, but only the husband could initiate it. Women could not leave their husbands unless they became widows. And guess what? Matchmakers had a role there too. They were the ones who might help a second match be arranged for a widow, but only if her virtue was intact. Which meant, ironically, the only thing worse than being married in Imperial China was being unmarried in Imperial China. Let's take a break from the abstract and enter the nightmare carousel of real-life historical matchmaking disasters. Case study, the Ming Dynasty. It was considered a golden age of culture and art, but if you were a woman, it was also a golden age of marital surveillance. Matchmakers during this time were not just intermediaries, they were enforcers of Confucian gender norms. If a girl resisted marriage, Matchmakers reported her defiance. If she dared love someone unapproved, the matchmaker could expose her, destroying reputations overnight. And the Imperial Palace? Oh, it had its own special matchmaking horror. Imperial concubines weren't matched for compatibility, they were selected for political loyalty and aesthetics. Matchmakers, and eunuchs, would literally measure the size of girls' feet, examine their skin tone under candlelight, and test their obedience before sending them to the emperor's harem. Being chosen was a death sentence wrapped in silk. Once inside the palace, you never left. Your family might gain prestige, but you became furniture with a pulse. Meanwhile, among the peasantry, matchmaking could be even more desperate. In famine-stricken regions, daughters were sometimes sold for marriage or servitude. Matchmakers acted as brokers, facilitating marriages where the bride was essentially sold as property. If a family had multiple daughters and couldn't afford to marry them all off, the matchmaker might arrange child brides, marrying a girl of 8 to a boy of 10, then sending her to live with his family for training. Yes, training. As in grooming, as in this was somehow normalized, all under the cheerful umbrella of tradition. And you might think, surely somewhere, someone questioned this? Occasionally, yes. Poets, especially women like Li Qingzhao, pushed back against the idea that love was irrelevant. Some court officials tried to regulate the more corrupt practices of matchmakers. But the system as a whole was a fortress, reinforced by Confucian ideals, legal precedent, and the iron grip of patriarchy. Even rebellion was systemized. In rare cases, women would refuse arranged marriages, often by suicide, a tragic act, but one that, disturbingly, became a way of preserving virtue. In other words, dying was sometimes the only honorable escape from a matchmaker's decision. So what did we learn in this first installment? Matchmakers in Imperial China were not love gurus. They were compliance officers in the grand machinery of gender politics. They upheld a brutal system where a girl's fate was sealed not by choice, but by paperwork, fortune-telling, and familial desperation. And the worst part? Everyone called it harmony. In part 2, we'll go deeper into how matchmaking operated in the Qing dynasty, what happened when class and matchmaking collided, and how the rise of foot-binding turned women into matrimonial trophies. Get ready for more bizarre customs, cruel twists, and the tragic comedy of arranged fates. Stay uncomfortable. Let's pick up where we left off, right in the middle of the most tightly orchestrated social manipulation scheme this side of Confucius. If the matchmaker in the Ming dynasty was a calculated enforcer of Confucian conformity, then the Qing dynasty took things to a whole new level. Because nothing says romantic connection quite like a state-enforced moral code, metaphysical compatibility charts, and a dose of manic ancestor worship. During the Qing, the matchmaking profession was more entrenched than ever, codified, regulated, and intimately tangled with everything from military promotion to criminal sentencing. Your marriage record, part of your social file, your family's reputation, hung on the wall like a tax receipt, and standing squarely between you and your future, the matchmaker, smiling sweetly like the human embodiment of a polite guillotine. The Qing dynasty was ruled by the Manchus, who were not Han Chinese, but rather than dismantle the old Confucian marriage ideals, they doubled down. Why? Because obedience to hierarchy was the glue that held their imperial Frankenstein of ethnicities together. The result? An even greater emphasis on marriage as a tool of political surveillance and cultural assimilation. Let's say you were a Manchu nobleman. Marrying a Han woman? That's a strategic alliance. Marrying the wrong Han woman? Now you're risking betrayal by way of bedroom. Enter the matchmaker, tasked with investigating not just your intended bride, but her entire family line. Were they loyal to the dynasty? Had any of them flirted with rebellion? Did her grandfather once forget to bow during a festival? That's a red flag. Meanwhile, among the Han Chinese, foot binding had reached its grotesque zenith. Women were judged not just by their family status or astrological sign, but by how tightly their feet could be broken and mutilated into lotus-shaped symbols of virtue. And the matchmaker? She was your judge and jury. A good matchmaker didn't just arrange meetings. She measured feet, sometimes by hand. A girl with feet too large? Unmarriageable. A girl with feet perfectly bound even if she limped in agony and could barely walk to the altar. Now, that's a wife material. In elite families, feet under 3 inches were considered ideal. Let that sink in. that's smaller than a deck of cards. And somehow, matchmakers saw this as a feature, not a red flag from hell. So here you were, limping into your future marriage, unable to walk, speak freely, or pick your own husband, but congratulations. The stars say you're a good match. Now let's talk about money, because money always follows misery. The Qing period saw the explosion of marriage markets, public spaces, often near temples where parents, matchmakers, and even professional marriage brokers gathered to swap biodata like Pokemon cards. They came armed with scrolls, family trees, dowry promises, and subtle lies. In these chaotic bazaars of destiny, women were rarely present. Their fates were bartered while they were at home, practicing embroidery or perfecting the art of smiling without showing teeth. And in case you thought matchmakers were only the domain of the upper class, surprise! The poor were not exempt, only more desperate. Let's visit the rural countryside, where rice was scarce and hope even scarcer. Matchmakers here operated like black market traders, arranging ghost marriages, child betrothals, or even widow recycling. Yes, let's unpack that horror. A ghost marriage was arranged between a living person and a dead one, usually to appease a restless spirit or preserve a lineage. Matchmakers arranged these with shocking regularity. They'd find an unmarried girl, sometimes a living one, sometimes a recently deceased one, and match her to a dead bachelor. The girl was then married into the family of the dead man and lived as a ghost daughter-in-law. Her job? Tend to the ancestral altar, serve tea to in-laws, and definitely not have a personality. Then there's the charming practice of widow recycling. In theory, widows were supposed to remain loyal to their dead husbands forever. In practice, many families were broke and didn't want the financial burden of an extra mouth. Enter the matchmaker again, ready to sell or remarry the widow, often against her will. And once again, virtue be damned if the rice barrel was empty. Matchmakers arranged these pairings early, often when the children were infants. The girl would grow up in the household of her future in-laws, learning to serve them, obey them, and marry the boy she called Big Brother. It was like raising your own daughter to one day be your daughter-in-law, a system that blurred the line between grooming and gaslighting, and guess who facilitated it? Your friendly neighborhood matchmaker. Now, let's talk about corruption. The matchmaking profession was so ingrained in society that it spawned its own subclass of tricksters. Fake matchmakers would forge family records, falsify baazi, or simply con both sides with inflated promises. There were even matchmakers who sold girls into brothels under the guise of marriage, knowing full well the husband was actually a madam in disguise. Some parents were complicit, others were simply fooled. Either way, the result was the same. A girl vanished into the underworld while her family consoled themselves with a few silver taels. Of course, not everyone was passive. Some women tried to resist. They ran away, shaved their heads to become nuns, or even mutilated themselves to avoid marriage. But these were acts of desperation, not choice. Because saying no to a matchmaker was saying no to your family, your lineage, your ancestors, your government, and sometimes your very right to exist. And what about love? In short, it was a liability. Falling in love with someone outside a matchmaker's approved list could destroy your entire family. If a girl was caught exchanging poems with a boy, scandal. If a boy fell for a girl from a bad family, disgrace. If they eloped, exile. Or worse, execution for violating familial duty. The matchmaker wasn't just protecting marriage, she was gatekeeping reality itself. Now let's pause for a moment and imagine this. You are a girl of 15. You've spent your whole life learning how to kneel correctly, how to embroider cranes without looking smug, and how to smile when your ribs are crushed into a silk corset. One day, your parents summon you. A matchmaker is coming. She has a scroll, a name, a promise, and zero concern for what you want. You dress in red, you bow, you marry, and if you're lucky, you survive. In part 3, we'll dive into the Imperial court again, where matchmakers operated like spies, where concubine selection resembled a beauty pageant with political undertones, and where matchmaking was used to destroy rivals and engineer dynastic collapse. We'll also uncover the eerie afterlife of matchmaking, when dead women were still being matched to dead men, because nothing says everlasting love like marrying a ghost. Hold on to your souls. It only gets darker from here. By now, you've seen how the matchmaker wasn't just a helpful old lady with a ledger. She was the unholy hybrid of private investigator, social enforcer, and undercover customs agent, sniffing out family secrets, aligning birth charts, and orchestrating futures with the precision of a celestial accountant. But if you thought her reach ended at the front door of your rural village or your over-decorated parlor in Hangzhou, think again. Let's step into the forbidden walls of the Imperial court. At the top of this gilded pyramid sat the emperor, divine, untouchable, and most importantly, in constant need of many women. Wives, concubines, bed warmers, symbolic partners for rituals. His love life was less about passion and more about politics, feng shui, and superstition. So how did a woman get into the palace? Through an imperial matchmaking system so elaborate it made ordinary village matchmaking look like speed dating. Every few years, the palace would announce a nationwide selection of maidens for imperial service, known as the draft of the palace women. Families with daughters between ages 13 and 16 would line up like contestants in a pageant they never volunteered for. Beauty mattered, but not too much. Virtue mattered, but in a specific flavor. And political loyalty? Oh, absolutely required. Matchmakers here were not lone agents, but state officials, sometimes eunuchs, sometimes senior noblewomen, tasked with screening candidates with all the warmth of a customs officer at 3 a.m. They would evaluate facial symmetry, voice softness, bone structure, and, let's not forget, astrological compatibility with the emperor's cosmic vibrations. And here's the kicker. Your daughter might never come back. If she was chosen as a concubine, great, that's the jackpot. She might bear the next heir, earn a title, and live in luxurious loneliness. But if she wasn't chosen, she might be sent to serve in silence in the laundry bureau or as a servant to a higher-ranked consort. Forbidden to leave, forbidden to marry, forbidden to feel anything remotely human. But hey, at least the family could boast that their daughter made it past round 2. Within the court, matchmakers became strategic weapons. Rival families would place allies within the matchmaking circles, ensuring that their nieces or cousins were discovered by the right official. Meanwhile, existing consorts who wanted to sabotage competition would bribe matchmakers to assign unfavorable birth dates, spread rumors, or, my personal favorite, swap the astrological charts. Imagine being thrown out of a once-in-a-lifetime marriage opportunity because some bureaucrat moved your Jupiter retrograde by 2 degrees. That's ancient sabotage at its finest. But the real game began after the women entered the palace, because now they weren't just wives, they were political chess pieces, and matchmakers didn't disappear. No, they worked in the shadows to keep alliances stable or deliberately unstable. Want to weaken a prince's maternal clan? Marry him to a nobody with no power. Want to manipulate a succession crisis? Arrange for the emperor to accidentally sleep with a girl from a rival house during an eclipse. Want to send a message to a rebellious province? Match one of their daughters into the palace and then banish her publicly. And let's not pretend the women had any agency. A concubine couldn't say no. A wife couldn't escape. An empress, if she had power, could try to protect her offspring, but even she was subject to the whims of the court astrologers and the matchmaking department's careful manipulations. If her family fell out of favor, the matchmakers made sure her nieces married down. Her cousins were overlooked, and her lineage withered away in bureaucratic obscurity. But perhaps the darkest expression of matchmaking wasn't about life at all. It was about death. Enter the practice of posthumous matchmaking. Yes, the dead had to marry too. This was particularly prevalent among elite families obsessed with ancestral purity and continuity. Let's say a favored son died unmarried. What a disaster. His spirit would be lonely, unable to carry on the family line in the afterlife. The solution? A ghost marriage. A matchmaker would be hired, yes, paid in full, to locate the corpse of a recently deceased girl, or worse, purchase a living girl to be ritually killed and buried as his bride. Oh, you thought the afterlife was going to be peaceful? Think again. Your eternity might involve being married off to a stranger, stuffed in a coffin, and buried next to someone you never met, just to make sure the family ancestors wouldn't get cranky. And if a matchmaker couldn't find the right corpse, they'd make one. There are grim records, very grim, of poor families selling their daughters to be ghost brides. Sometimes they were suffocated, drowned, or simply disappeared to create the illusion of a simultaneous death. The girl's family received compensation, the boy's family received spiritual assurance, and the matchmaker, She took a neat cut and moved on to the next client. If you were rich, matchmaking was a weapon. If you were poor, it was a trap. If you were royal, it was a curse with a gold ribbon. But no matter your station, matchmakers had the last word on who you loved, who you wed, and who you were allowed to become. Even the act of falling in love outside the matchmaker's reach was an act of rebellion. Poems were exchanged in secret. Glances were stolen across courtyards. But if you got caught, oof. Punishments ranged from flogging and exile to being buried alive. Literally, alive, under a wall. Because forbidden love in Imperial China wasn't just frowned upon, it was treason against the social order. And so, families played along. Girls were trained from birth to speak sweetly to the matchmaker. Boys were groomed to accept their fate with dull-eyed resignation. And the matchmaker? She moved from house to house like a traveling omen, sometimes bringing hope, more often delivering quiet doom. In part 4, we'll finish the story. The downfall of traditional matchmaking during the 20th century, how communist reforms tried to crush it, and why even today echoes of the Imperial matchmaker still whisper in China's digital dating algorithms. It's not over, it never really ended. Buckle up. The final twist is coming. So by now, you've had your fill of matchmaking horror stories, arranged childhoods, ghost weddings, political sabotage, and the soft rustle of silk robes hiding sharp knives. But what happened when the dynasty collapsed? When emperors fell, matchmakers stumbled too. But don't celebrate yet, because like all persistent parasites of history, they mutated. Let's talk about the implosion of the old matchmaking world, and the cold modern rebirth of the very same nightmare in new packaging. By the late 19th century, the Qing dynasty was limping toward its inevitable funeral. Western imperialists were crashing in with trains, opium, and photography, while reformists inside China were starting to ask uncomfortable questions like, do women deserve autonomy? Should children choose their own spouses? And the wuzuo, ever dangerous, maybe matchmaking isn't divine destiny, it's just control? The matchmakers, predictably, didn't appreciate this vibe, but the real executioner wore a red star. When the Communist Party seized power in 1949, Chairman Mao didn't just want to topple landlords, he wanted to raze the entire Confucian framework to the ground. Out with ancestor worship, out with arranged marriages, out with feudal customs. The new regime rolled out the marriage law of 1950, declaring, radically, that marriage should be based on love. Consent was required. Women could file for divorce. Matchmaking was, at least officially, dead. Cue nationwide panic from aunties everywhere. Matchmakers were suddenly cast as relics of a decaying past, symbols of inequality and enemies of progress. Many of them were literally paraded through the streets, beaten, publicly shamed, and told to reform their thinking. The ones who didn't disappear into re-education camps fled into hiding, or switched careers and started selling sewing needles. And for a few brief decades, it looked like the matchmaker's reign had truly ended. But just when we thought the ghost was exorcised, surprise, the matchmaker came back, digitized, streamlined, and soulless. Today, the spirit of the Imperial matchmaker lives on, in your phone. Modern China may not worship ancestral spirits anymore, but they worship data, and matchmaking has evolved into an algorithmic nightmare fueled by facial recognition, education filters, income brackets, and horoscope sliders. Apps like Baihei, Tantan, and Momo now play the role of palace eunuchs, silent, efficient, and creepy. But it's not just dating apps. No. Enter the marriage market. In public parks across cities like Shanghai and Beijing, hundreds of parents gather every weekend and lay out laminated posters advertising their single children. Height, income, zodiac sign, profession, car ownership status. Photographs optional. Consent also optional. If you're lucky, your mom might only be talking to 5 other moms at the same time. And who are the facilitators of this modern chaos? You guessed it, matchmakers. Not old village ladies anymore, but well-dressed consultants who charge tens of thousands of yuan to arrange introductions, vet family backgrounds, and optimize romantic compatibility. They even offer emotion coaching to teach you how to act, like someone worthy of love, because being yourself isn't profitable. In this glossy dystopia, love is a subscription package, and even in the countryside, matchmakers are experiencing a disturbing revival. Faced with gender imbalances caused by decades of the one-child policy and a culture that still often prizes sons, rural families are again leaning on matchmakers to find brides at any cost. Sometimes that means cross-border trafficking. Sometimes it means marriages that look suspiciously like purchases. Oh, and remember ghost marriages? Still happening, secretly, especially in rural areas where people might dig up corpses, steal remains, or pay bribes to funeral home workers to supply a suitable bride for a deceased son. It's illegal, of course. But then again, so was matchmaking once. Meanwhile, the psychological scars left by centuries of coercive matchmaking haven't healed. They've just mutated. Young people face crippling family pressure to marry before 30. Government-backed campaigns shame leftover women. Educated, successful women who aren't married by age 27. Men face social judgment if they're poor or unmarried, despite being products of the same toxic expectations. And matchmaking companies? They've added AI compatibility scores and facial symmetry scanners to enhance efficiency. We've essentially replaced dusty family scrolls with sleek biometric profiling. And what about love? It still exists. It still breaks through against all odds like wildflowers between stone slabs. But make no mistake, the matchmaker never died. She just put on a power suit and learned to code. So next time you swipe, match, or politely endure a family dinner where your auntie starts listing eligible candidates, pause for a moment. Remember that your ancestors once faced the same terrifying fate, minus the Wi-Fi. Whether through a whispered recommendation, a tea leaf reading, or a TikTok astrology girl recommending your moon match, the same ancient machinery hums beneath. Because the disturbing truth is this: we never really left Imperial China. We just built a glossier empire and let the matchmakers upgrade their weapons. Thanks for surviving the journey. And if you're lucky enough to be in love right now, hold them close. Don't let a bureaucrat, algorithm, or ghost bride steal them away. Not again.